Good evening, everyone. My name is Sarah Larson. I'm the Executive Director of Awake Milwaukee, and I'm really honored to welcome you here tonight for 20 years since Spotlight, how journalists have uncovered sexual abuse in the Catholic Church. It is really good to see so many familiar faces here tonight and a lot of people who are new to the Awake community. So for those of you who are new to Awake, we are a growing grassroots Catholic nonprofit organization founded in August 2019 with a mission to awaken our community to the full reality of sexual abuse in the Catholic Church and work for transformation and healing in the Archdiocese of Milwaukee and beyond. So this is the third event in Awake's second season of Courageous Conversations. And our goals with this series are to build community, deepen understanding, encourage conversation, and inspire action in response to the complex issue of sexual abuse in the Catholic Church. So we have a two-part format for these Courageous Conversations. Part one begins tonight, where you'll hear from our panelists and have an opportunity for some audience questions. And then part two will take place next week, and that has a focus on small group discussions. So you'll hear more on that at the end of tonight. We are so glad that each of you made the choice to be here tonight. We have quite a large and diverse group of people gathered from around the United States, from Canada and beyond. And we want you to know that whatever thoughts, experiences, or emotions you bring to this conversation, you are very valued and welcome here. I want to specifically welcome those of you who have experienced sexual abuse in the Catholic Church as children or as adults. I am so sorry for the ways that you have been harmed, but I am very honored that you chose to join us this evening. And I want to acknowledge that while we are highlighting the work of journalists in uncovering sexual abuse in the church, we know that none of this would have been possible without the courageous survivors who spoke up and told their stories. Tonight, please take care of yourself in whatever ways you need to. And if anything in this conversation is too painful or triggering for you, please feel free to log off or take a break and then reach out to someone who can offer you support. I also want to welcome the many journalists who are joining us tonight on our panel, of course, but also in our audience. Please know how much we value your efforts to bring hard truths to light. Personally, I know I would not be doing this work today without the powerful media stories that woke me up and compelled me to action. So thank you for your important work. I want to give a few logistical announcements before we begin. First, thank you to everyone who has been introducing themselves in the chat box. At this point, we're going to turn off the group chat feature so that we can all remain focused on the presentation going forward. Also, it's really nice to see your smiling faces as we gather, but we'll encourage you now to turn off your video at this time, unless you're one of our panelists, and change your Zoom setting to speaker view. And that will just help all of us concentrate as well. Our panelists will be responding to audience questions later in the program. So if you have a question that you would like the panelists to address, you can send it to Catherine, and her name under her name there is the word questions. And so you can send questions directly to her by selecting her name from the drop-down box at the bottom of the chat screen. Just to let you know, today's session will be recorded and shared on Awake's YouTube channel, but we are recording in speaker mode, so your name, your video, and any chat comments will be kept private. So all of that said, it is now my honor to introduce tonight's panelists who will help us consider the role of journalists in uncovering sexual abuse in the Catholic Church. We'll not only hear about the Boston Globe's award-winning work to expose abuse and cover-up in the Archdiocese of Boston, but we'll also hear about pioneering reporting on this topic, which began almost 20 years earlier, as well as ongoing investigative efforts that continue today. So first, we'll begin tonight with Walter Robinson, editor-at-large at the Boston Globe, who's also known by his nickname Robbie. Robbie was born in Boston and raised in Melrose, a near suburb. He attended Boston College High School and Northeastern University in Boston. He began working at the Globe in 1972, 50 years ago this month. He served as a political and investigative reporter, filing stories from 48 of the 50 states and more than 30 foreign countries. From 2000 to 2006, he led the Boston Globe Spotlight team, a group of top reporters that takes on long-term investigations. In 2001, the team began investigating sexual abuse by priests and the cover-up by officials in the Archdiocese of Boston. This reporting won the 2003 Pulitzer Prize for Public Service. Later, the Spotlight team's work on clergy abuse was depicted in the Oscar-winning film Spotlight. Actor Michael Keaton portrayed Robbie in the film. Since leaving the Spotlight team in 2006, Robbie has served as a journalism professor at Northeastern University in Boston and Arizona State University in Phoenix. Robbie, we are honored to have you join us this evening, especially given that apparently today is your birthday. So thank you so much for spending your birthday with us.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. We are glad to have you. And I'm going to introduce our next guest, Ann Barrett Doyle, who is the co-director of bishopaccountability.org, which is an extensive archive of information about sexual abuse in the Catholic Church. Their website includes survivor accounts, tens of thousands of church documents related to abuse, and more than 100,000 news stories about the crisis. If you haven't yet visited the Bishop Accountability website, I would encourage you to do so. Anne grew up in Reading, Massachusetts, outside of Boston, the seventh of 10 children. She attended Reading High School and entered Harvard at the age of 16. She and her husband, Bill, met at a Catholic church near campus. The couple had 4 small children in January 2002, when the Spotlight stories first appeared on the front page of the Boston Globe. After reading those stories, Anne and her husband drove the family to protest outside the Archdiocesan Cathedral. She went on to organize dozens of protests over the next 2 years. During this time, she met Terry McKiernan, a fellow devout Catholic and parent. When Terry founded Bishop Accountability in 2003, with the goal of ensuring that information about abuse cases was accessible and would stay that way, Anne joined him. Anne, you have a deep knowledge about how media coverage has shaped the abuse crisis over the last 20 years, and we are so pleased that you have joined us tonight.
Thank you very much. Delighted to be here.
And finally, I'm honored to introduce Jason Berry, an investigative reporter, author, and filmmaker who lives in New Orleans. He is best known for his pioneering reporting on sexual abuse in the Catholic Church. Berry attended Jesuit High School in New Orleans and earned a bachelor's degree from Georgetown. In 1985, as a freelance journalist, Jason began covering the case of Gilbert Gauthier, a priest in the Diocese of Lafayette, Louisiana, who abused children and was moved by his bishop from parish to avoid scandal. Jason expanded his reporting to cover sexual abuse and cover-up in other dioceses and wrote news stories that ran in the National Catholic Reporter beginning in 1985. He went on to write the book, Lead Us Not Into Temptation, Catholic Priests and the Sexual Abuse of Children, which was published in 1992. During that period, he appeared alongside victim survivors on talk shows, including Donahue and Oprah, to discuss the abuse crisis, and he was widely interviewed on network news programs. He wrote a 2004 book, Vows of Silence, with the late Gerald Renner, which deals with sexual abuse by Father Marcial Maciel, the founder of the Legion of Christ, and the cover-up by the Vatican. In his long career as a journalist and author, Jason has also written extensively about jazz music and recently made a film called City of a Million Dreams, which shares the history of jazz funerals in New Orleans and is based on his 2018 book of the same title. The documentary is appearing at film festivals and outreach screenings this year. Jason, we are so pleased to have you on our panel today.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be with you and the other panelists.
So let's begin our conversation, and I will turn it now to Erin O'Donnell, a member of the Awake Leadership Team and the editor of the Awake blog, who will be moderating our conversation. Go ahead, Erin.
Thank you, Sarah. Good evening, everyone. And I know we're all very eager to hear from our panelists. So I have a question to start us off this evening, a question for all three panelists. And if you could name one thing that you'd like our audience to know about the role of journalists in exposing the sexual abuse crisis in the Catholic Church, what would that one idea be? And Anne, if we could begin with you.
Sure, thank you. The Catholic Church's cover-up depended on its total power to hide crimes and to keep the information buried and to control the public narrative. And the church, unchecked, also made sure that the victims were kept powerless, kept in the dark at their mercy. Good journalism upended all of this in the most constructive way possible. It empowered victims and it cowed the criminals. Accountability cannot happen without public disclosure, period. The church has repeatedly tried, and it's still trying, to police itself. It simply cannot do it because it's too devoted to secrecy and to its institutional preservation. So when the news media gathers evidence of cover-up and reports it, a virtuous cycle begins. Disclosure leads to more disclosure, and in best cases leads to prosecutions, better laws, and a more educated public. And all of these conditions are crucial to holding the Catholic hierarchy accountable and making the church a safer place for children.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you. Robbie, if we could go to you next, what's the one thing that you'd like to start us off with tonight about the role of journalists?
Well, I could think of about 10, but let me just pick one. And one of the things that's been unique about this story is the extent to which journalists who've become involved in it are propelled forward by a sense of outrage at what they're finding. And the more they learn, the more outraged we became, certainly. And that drove us to work. We worked for months on end, 7 days a week, trying to dig this story up. And I know other journalists who felt the same way about this kind of story, and that is not a normal emotion when you're approaching even an investigative topic. But in this case, we were so appalled by what we were finding out that it gave us the energy to just keep going.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing that. And Jason, let's go to you. Sort of one big idea or one main idea about the role of journalists to get us started here.
Well, I would certainly echo what Robbie and Anne have just said. And maybe I could sort of cap that idea with a small story, an anecdote. In 1980, early 1986, I had done 6 months worth of reporting for the Times of Acadiana in Lafayette. This is in a city of 90,000 people, deeply Catholic, Cajun country. We had taken a lot of flack. Some of the pieces had come out in National Catholic Reporter and gotten national coverage. But I was having dinner with the editor, Richard Baudouin, who had been several years behind me at Jesuit High School in New Orleans. And he said, I'm thinking about doing an editorial. And I said, great. My final big piece was going to say, and did say, that there were 7 priests who had been recycled over a period of, I think 15 or 20 years, victims in all of these outlying small towns. This may seem quite small compared to what the Globe later did, but you got to realize that this is fossil record material now. And he said, what do you think I should say in this editorial? I'm thinking about saying that the bishop should resign. And I said, Richard, I think that's absolutely what you should say. And then he said, I'm thinking about saying that the Vatican should remove the bishop if he won't resign. And I said, you should absolutely say that. And he kind of nodded. And he said, I've never written an editorial like this. And I said, Richard, no one has ever written an editorial like this. Here we are, this is what, 30 or whatever years ago, more than 30 years ago. And the paper was subjected to an advertiser's boycott that lasted about 2 or 3 months before the powers that be realized it's wiser to let the paper exist. They lost about $20,000, which back then was roughly the salary of one of the advertising salespersons, all of whom were women. So I cite that because public opinion was in our favor. Most of the people contacting the newspaper, it was an alternative weekly, it was a scrappy, muckraking paper, but everybody, for the most part, was behind us. And even large papers know this. The hostile mail you tend to get is usually from a small group of people. And what you really want to know is what the great majority think. Well, if they're not sending you angry mail, you figure you got them on your side. So I think the lesson journalistically is that we have to keep pushing. And now the plates have shifted so dramatically that most Catholics want to be informed. So I think we have the public on our side. The bishops are in a kind of siege mentality because of so much litigation these days. But I think most people want to be informed, and it's the job of the press to do that.
Excellent. Thank you. Thanks for getting us started. Jason, let's turn to talk a little bit more about the investigations that the investigative reporting you did. And I just really want our audience to take in the fact that your initial reporting on clergy abuse, you were doing this more than 15 years at least, before the Boston Globe Spotlight team turned their attention to this topic. So we should just take that in for a moment, that was quite a bit, earlier. So Jason, tell us how you came upon the story of Gilbert Gothée. How did you start reporting?
Well, he was indicted in the fall of 1984 in Lafayette. I lived then, as I do now, about 135 miles away in New Orleans. It was a news item, but oddly not on the front page. I saw it, I was sort of struck by it. Within a few weeks, I began having conversations with lawyers who were quite involved in this. One of them, Ray Mouton, was the attorney who defended Gothée on the criminal charges. But I also had a conversation with a guy named Raoul Bencomo, who was a year behind me at Jesuit High School, a plaintiff attorney who was representing a number of the victims and their families. And I should say that the word survivor was not in my vocabulary then. And anyway, I got access in early 1985 to some of the depositions. And I remember sitting in Bencomo's office with the light coming through the shades, reading these deposition testimony transcripts that no other journalist had seen. And I was just agog. I was stunned that the bishop and another diocesan official had moved this guy around for so long, knowing what he had previously done. And I immediately thought of Watergate. It was a cover-up to me. Strangely enough, I never thought of it as a religion story. I thought of it as a story a political story, the abuse of power. So I got shot down by all kinds of places, the New York Times Magazine and others. I pitched them and everybody said no. So I got a joint assignment from the weekly paper in Lafayette, whose editor was a friend of mine. And that's when I sort of discovered NCR. I was aware of it, but I talked to Tom Fox, the editor, and told him what I had. And he agreed to a joint assignment. And so I spent most of the spring of 1985 working on it. The first articles came out in the early summer, continued, and then that's how I got going.
Right. And NCR is National Catholic Reporter.
Yes.
Right. Why was it the case that no one wanted to touch the story? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, the Times-Picayune, and this is in my book, Lead Us Not Into Temptation, and I have friends at the Picayune, and I've written for them since then as a freelance, but they were threatened with a libel suit by Gothe's attorney, Mouton, who fixated on a technicality in one of their reports. And I said to him at the time, that really stinks. You're trying to, get this newspaper to back off. And he said, yeah, does it stink any more than what they said about my client? And the issue was that Gothe had kissed these children on retreat. And I said, well, there's a whole other set of depositions that goes much deeper. And I'll never forget him saying, I have nothing to say about that. So it was an odd media environment. The largest paper in the state had backed off. The daily paper in Lafayette, the Advertiser, I think it's a charitable understatement to say that they did not have a tradition of holding power accountable. I would even say it was an aptly named daily paper. And they ended up attacking the weekly paper for all the reporting. I was called a vulture of yellow journalism. I mean, it was a newspaper war, really. It was rather ironic, given that we were exposing child abuse. But, without trying to make this too sort of about me, the thing that just kept being driven home to me was how much people in this deeply Catholic community were on our side. We got phone calls every time the Advertiser would attack us or attack me. People would call up and say, you're doing the right thing, keep doing it. And in the long run, even though there was an Advertiser's boycott, it fizzled. But I think the lesson I learned from that is that you can attack the messenger, but the message will come out. And, if I may, not to steal the thunder from my good friend at the Boston Globe, but, when Cardinal Law made his statement, I think it was in 93, Robbie will correct me, when he said, we call down the power, God's power, on the press, particularly the Globe. Well, you make a statement like that, you're leading with your chin and you're kind of asking for it in a way. But I think a lot of bishops felt initially that they could use the sort of power and symbolism of the church to try to make the media back down. And of course it failed.
Right. After you published your book, Lead Us Not Into Temptation, you did a lot of traveling around the country and speaking. Sarah mentioned that you appeared on Oprah and Donahue. You were on news programs. And then can you say a little bit about what happened to the coverage?
Yeah, it went away. And the reason it went away, this was in 94, early 95, if I'm not mistaken. There was a lawsuit filed. There was a tremendous buildup of media coverage in the early 90s. And there was a lawsuit filed against Cardinal Bernardin of Chicago by a young man who had AIDS and was dying, and who claimed that he had been abused by the cardinal when he was a seminarian. I mean, this was a huge story at the time. And the young plaintiff soon withdrew his case, saying he couldn't trust his memories. And as a consequence, the whole media narrative shifted almost overnight from bishops covering up abusive clerics to false memory, vagaries of the mind, quack therapists. In fact, in 1 week, Time magazine had a cover of Freud as a picture puzzle disassembling. US News had a similar cover. And I mean, within just a couple of weeks, I hate to use the term momentum, but that is a reality in media coverage. It shifted. It went away from the church, and there were major stories, major events over the next 5 or 6, 7 years. But it really wasn't until 2002, on January 6th, when the Globe began their series, that the rest of the media kind of came back. And then it was like a tsunami. It was an extraordinary thing to see.
Yes, and I'm really excited to talk more about that. Robbie, let's turn to you and the Spotlight team. Those of us who've watched the movie Spotlight know that it shows that your team looked into the topic of clergy abuse when the new editor, Marty Barron, arrived at the paper. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how his status as an outsider, what role did that play in his suggesting that you cover that topic?
Yeah, well, I mean, clearly it was without Marty, without his fresh pair of eyes, without his intellect, without his commitment to investigative reporting, I'm not sure that we would have done what we did. The Globe, we had a case in Fall River, Massachusetts in the early 90s of Father James Porter, and the Globe covered that extensively. But as in most of the cases around the country, there weren't documents. And so there was a lot of speculation about cover-up, but the church, I think, not just in Boston, but elsewhere, had been very adept at, when these cases occurred, at describing each of them as the case of one single aberrant priest, and we've taken care of it. And I think generally, and I sort of speak for the Globe on this, I think our view of the church, most of us, certainly mine, was it was unimaginable that an institution so iconic as the Catholic Church would not only cover up, but would enable this extraordinary abuse of countless thousands of children who are in its care. I mean, the idea that this was going on, I mean, I can't tell you how many times people have said, I can't believe what I'm reading. Mm-hmm. So Marty came along, and his very first day as editor of the Globe, he walked into the morning news meeting, and he had read a column the day before by Eileen McNamara about the case of this one priest, John Gagan. There were 84 lawsuits against Gagan. The Globe, the Herald, the Boston Phoenix had all, over 2 or 3 years, tried to get into that story, but couldn't nail it. Mm-hmm. And Marty read this column, and the columnist, Eileen McNamara, said, "The truth may never be known." And to Marty, that he said, we're in the business of finding out the truth. And that very first day, he asked our lawyers to file a motion to unseal the Gagan records. And we actually didn't think there was much chance of that happening, because the judge assigned to the case, Constance Sweeney, had 16 years of Catholic education. And the early betting was, oh boy. But in fact, in the end, she ruled in our favor. And her ruling was precedential, because she ended up, once the dam broke, handling all of the cases. And in every case, her ruling was that not only would the documents be unsealed, but that they had to be turned over to the media. And so we had, I mean, in Gagan's case alone, we had 10,000 pages of documents. And over a year and a half, I think we way over 100,000 pages of documents that that came out. So Marty took a big risk on behalf of the Globe, but I think he saw the story a little bit differently than it had been covered, and he asked the Spotlight team the very same day to look into the case of Gagan. And of course, it was the new boss, and we were so frightened of the new boss that we started out deciding that we knew nothing about this subject, the Spotlight team, and that we would call everybody we could think of who knew anything about this. And within a week, a little more than a week, we got information indicating that one lawyer told us that Gagan was the tip of a very large iceberg. And we thought, oh my God, there might be 12 or 15 priests. And it, as you know, in Boston, it ended up 250 priests abused children, which is, by the way, 10.75% of all the priests who served during that 50 or 60 year period. So that's how we got launched on that stuff.
You know, it's interesting, that idea that, you know, sort of hardened journalists thought the truth may never be known before. And I just wonder, you know, can you talk a little bit about apprehension on the Globe staff about covering this topic?
Yeah, I don't think there was, you know, Jason mentioned this incident in 1993 where Cardinal Law, referencing our coverage of the Porter case in Fall River, called down the power of God on the media and especially the Globe. And little known fact is, a week later, our editor, Jack Driscoll, fell and broke his leg and almost died in hospital from an infection he got. But I think reporters, I would have to say back then that our religion reporter, in my memory, going back to the 70s when I started at the Globe, the religion reporter was, in my memory, always a devout Catholic. And I think, you know, in hindsight, that's obviously not necessarily something you want to do every time you change religion reporters, but the Globe did that. So, and in Boston is the most Catholic of the major cities in the country, or was then, and the Cardinal Archbishop was arguably the most powerful political figure in Massachusetts. And in fact, throughout the 90s, there'd been a coalition of ministers and rabbis who every year had filed legislation in Massachusetts that would would include clergymen among those who were mandated reporters, that they would have to report to the government any suspicions they had about the abuse of children. And this is a law in I think every state in the country has a law like this. And they wanted to include clergy people in Massachusetts. And every year that bill died in committee. And the reason it died in committee is because every year the Archdiocese lobbyists at the Massachusetts State House made sure that legislation was killed. And in May of 2002, the legislature, after the stories started to come out, the legislature passed and the governor signed that into law. But that was an indication of the power of the church. And obviously the church wanted that legislation killed because it was so vulnerable to what had been going on within its own ranks.
Right. And so as you dove into this reporting, when did it occur to you, yes, this is a story worth pursuing?
Well, I think when we started out, we were, you're dealing with an institution that has no obligation to report anything publicly and is very secretive about virtually everything it does. And so we were at the outset, not knowing much about the subject, trying to figure out, what's the way in on this. And, we turned very quickly to Phil Saviano, God rest his wonderful soul, who died recently, who started the New England chapter of SNAP, and who had spent a lot of time connecting with other survivors and who had a lot of information. And he, in fact, had approached the Globe at some point 5 years earlier, and nobody would take him seriously. And one of the reasons was that Phil was saying that this is an international criminal conspiracy that reaches to the Vatican. And that sort of assertion at that point in time was met with some skepticism, and it actually turned out to be a bit of an understatement. So Phil helped us connect to a number of other survivors, and he had the names of some of the priests for whom the church had made, lawyers knew that if they went right to the chancery with their victim, and that the church was willing to give them a bigger settlement than if they went into court and filed a lawsuit, which would be a public a document. So that was the principal way that the Archdiocese kept this cover-up going for so long.
Mm-hmm. So as you did dive in and start digging, I'm wondering if you could talk about how Jason Berry's previous reporting informed your work.
Well, that's an interesting question, and I'd say, without Jason, I don't think anything else would ever have been done anywhere, frankly. But the fact of the matter is, and I don't think we understood this at the time, even in 2002, is that back in the 1980s, when Jason was doing his work, nothing was online. And so at some point, and I've forgotten at what point this was, but it was after we began our reporting in 2001, we went and looked through our own archives, and the only thing the Globe had ever had about the case in Louisiana was a 280-word Associated Press story that ran, this big inside paper. And what happened, what certainly helped this create this tsunami of coverage is that when we started to publish in January of 2002, that was the dawn of the internet age. And I don't think we appreciated that at the moment, but all of our stories went viral and they went everywhere. And in fact, in the short period of time following the first stories, we had phone calls or emails from over 300 survivors just in the Boston Archdiocese. But we had emails and phone calls from all over the world, all over the country, and from India, from South Africa, from Ireland, from France, from Brazil. We had calls from victims of priests everywhere. And if if we'd had the internet in the mid 80s, I suspect that all of this might have come tumbling out then.
Right, right. And maybe you can sort of refresh the audience's memories about what happened once those stories appeared in the Globe. There was a tsunami of people who began reporting. What else happened? What did you see happen once those stories appeared?
Well, I mean, the sort of main driver of, or a major driver of our coverage once the stories began was the individual stories of survivors who called us. And I'd say the vast majority of the cases, the survivors who called us thought that they had been the only one that this had ever happened to. And in the vast majority of the cases, almost none of them had told anyone about it, even their spouses. And we had some, a relatively small number, but a small number of survivors who called us and wanted to go on the record and talk about their experience immediately. And we, so unlike reporters to do this, but we ended up counseling them. Perhaps you ought to think about talking to your family members first and your friends. You know, you don't want people who are close to you to read this in the newspaper. So it was this extraordinary outpouring of accounts of people who came forward, and as a consequence of that, you know, there were, I've forgotten the number, but I'm sure Anne has it, the number of priests, sadly, still only a small percentage of the priests who abused children were held criminally responsible, but there was, you know, a substantial number who were criminally charged, in some cases, largely because of survivors being willing to go to police.
Yes, and I'd love to hear from Jason as well, you know, about this is a really important thing to talk about the role of abuse survivors in helping you to tell those stories. Jason, do you have anything that you want to add about how survivors helped you in the reporting?
Yes, and Robbie makes a very good point about the power of the internet as it was, you know, just sort of a borning, so to speak. I want to go back just a few years prior to that. In 1997, the late Gerald Renner, who was the religion editor of the Hartford Courant, and I did a long investigative piece for that newspaper in Connecticut in 97 about a group of men from Mexico who, 8 of them, who gave long on-the-record interviews. I went to Mexico City and interviewed 6 of them. Jerry interviewed 2 of them in the Northeast. These were men talking about the nightmare they had endured as seminarians in the Legion of Christ under Father Maciel, the founder of that religious order, which was originally based in Mexico. By 97, when we did that story, Maciel was one of the most powerful priests in Rome. The article, which later really became the foundation for the book Vows of Silence in 2004, it led straight to John Paul II. We had letters that these men, certain of these men had written directly to the Pope, I mean, graphically stating what had happened to them. The Vatican refused to make any comment. They did not respond to our request at all, which was interesting because it wasn't a denial. It was just, we're not getting back to you. That story came out just as the internet was really starting. We tried all over the place to get other newspapers to cover it, particularly the New York Times. And for whatever reason, they did not. And so we ended up, along with the survivors, Renner and I, being attacked on a special website, legionaryfacts.org, which accused us of a conspiracy against this holy priest. This went on for 5 years. So, journalists are sort of accustomed to getting attacked by politicians or powerful people. I don't want to say it's water off the back, but you just sort of assume at some point, it may happen. This was devastating to these men in Mexico. They were held up to ridicule in some of the papers there. It was most unlike the situation 5 years later in Boston, when there was a tremendous upswelling, if that's a correct verb, of great sympathy for Phil Saviano, the other survivors, and a great outrage, at cardinal law and the hierarchy. Mexico is a very different country, even though it's one of the most Catholic countries on the earth. So these guys were out on a long limb for quite a while, especially with the encrusted machismo of that country. The suspicions that these men were gay and therefore they liked it. I mean, all these, terrible shibboleths. But I mention that because I think in many cases, the mentality of defense lawyers at a lot of these dioceses, who are very well paid, and they're doing everything they can to please the bishop, and of course they're billing heavily, is that, well, these survivors are sort of broken people, they're messy lives. If we can get them to settle for, modest amounts of money and agree not to talk, then everybody can wash their hands and go home. That was really the mentality. And I think the Globe covered that, quite well. Certainly they had help from lawyers like Mitchell Garabedian and others, plaintiff lawyers, who were trying to get this out. But I do think there has been a major sort of ground shift or paradigm shift, if you will, where today people are much more willing, and it's not just because of the Catholic Church. Me Too, the Me Too movement has had a huge impact in this regard. People realize that predatory sexual behavior is far more permeated in our society than before. And so, I think we're at a point now where society is much more sensitive to the plight of people who struggle, survivors particularly. And, the church has not changed nearly as much as it should, but I think it has made some modest progress in addressing these cases.
Excellent. Thank you, Jason. I want to shift to Anne, but I have some questions for you, Anne. But first, I'd like to remind our audience that we're really happy to get your questions for the panel. So if you have questions, please go ahead and submit them through chat to Catherine, who's taking them for the Awake team. So I would encourage you to do that if you have some questions raised by the things that our panelists are sharing this evening. So Anne, I would like to talk a little bit more about what happened for you personally after the stories began appearing in the Globe in 2002. If you can kind of take us through some of your thoughts at that point.
Well, it changed my life. It was beyond shocking, and it hit me in a way that other atrocities hadn't, because I wasn't just appalled, but I felt responsible in some way. I felt a sense of ownership. That my husband and I would pack up our kids and make them, get presentable every Sunday and go off to mass. And I was a questioning Catholic, but I also was determined to raise my kids as Catholics. I thought it would put them on the straight and narrow, at least give them a good beginning. And it made me into a grown-up. reading those stories. I thought I've been pretending this whole time. I mean, I showing too much deference to the priest. And this has always been sort of absurd that only one person gets to talk at the front of the church and the rest of us have to be quiet and listen, even if the sermon is boring or wrong-headed. And it should be shared power. It should be shared discourse. I always knew that, but this made me realize how grotesque that imbalance of power, the grotesque result. I thought Cardinal Law was a single rogue bishop and had done a really bad thing, would be really ashamed of himself. And it was in that spirit that I set off to confront him one Sunday in January. I just couldn't stand it anymore. And I was going to confront him in Mass at the Cathedral of the Holy Cross. I lost my courage to do that in the middle of Mass, but I went outside and there were 3 or 4 other people spontaneously gathered there, and we sort of traded contact information and started organizing protests, and it sort of became a thing in front of the cathedral. And I met survivors, and hearing their stories, I think probably as happened to Jason and to Robbie, changed me forever. I think it was a radicalizing experience. I didn't understand what corruption was. I didn't understand what total deception was. And it was utterly shocking. And it made me into a more responsible Catholic, you know, I believe.
Say a little bit more about what you mean.
Well, I think this church has an important role to play in the world, you know, especially with terms of climate change and injustices everywhere, but it can't very well exert its moral authority if it continues to be so corrupt on the inside, and if it's so cruel and heartless and deceptive to its own victims. So the only way I can keep showing up as a Catholic is to do work to force them into transparency, or at least help empower the victims by putting information out in the public.
Thank you for sharing that. So, Anne, you began to talk about this at the very start of our evening, but let's just let me ask the question again. You know, what do you see would have happened if journalists like Jason and Robbie and the Spotlight team had not reported the stories that they did?
Well, if they hadn't reported it, the church would, continue to control the narrative. The victims really had very little recourse. Even if a victim were able to win a lawsuit, the church could, even if that got reported, the church could spin that any way they wanted to. It didn't, without the press expanding and delving deep, it had the impact of a tree falling in the forest and no one hearing it. And victims were really without very little recourse until the news media started reporting their stories, and importantly, investigating the church. It's not enough to just tell a story of a victim's suffering. You also have to go after who covered up and what the church knew and when they knew it.
Aaron, may I
Yeah.
say something?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. It's very hard to follow Anne, let me say. No, I'm serious. She's so eloquent and dead on. But there's one missing piece here I really want to add to fill into everything that both she and Robbie have said. And that is the groundbreaking and continuing role of National Catholic Reporter. NCR in 1985 ran a digest of the original articles I did in Lafayette. And mind you, I had a joint assignment. I couldn't have done it without money from both papers. And it wasn't a lot of money, but it was enough. The board of National Catholic, well, at the time, NCR, I think, had about 40,000 readers. You know, it's the voice of the liberal church, and had done a lot of, Seymour Hersh, among other people, had written pieces for them. So it had a really good record journalistically. There was a priest, Father Joseph Fichter, a sociologist from here in New Orleans. He was at Loyola. He was on the board. He was outraged by the article that I had done, the long piece, and equally outraged by Tom Fox, the editor's sidebar editorial, in which he said, this is in 1985, that the church needed to establish independent review boards, that they needed to look into this issue in depth. And so he went into the board meeting and said, I think we should fire Tom Fox. And so the board members said, well, Tom, go out of the room. And so he had to go out of the room and wait to see if he had a job. And in the end, the vote was, I think it was 5 or 6 to 1 against Fichter to, maintain Tom's position. And Fichter then quit. Well, from 1985 through 2001, NCR did more reporting on this issue than any other outlet in the United States, and I dare say probably in the world. And that's to take nothing away from the Pulitzer Prize winning series that the Globe did, all deserved. But NCR was really a voice in the wilderness. I did stories for them, many other people did, but they really kept after it. And right now, if you read the editorials over the last several years that Tom Roberts has done, these things are far beyond anything the secular press has published. And I don't think there are many, look, we can all beat our chest and say, we're the press, we got the Catholic Church, we exposed the story. But you look at some of those editorials and they are drilling down on the depths of corruption within the hierarchy itself, the problem of clericalism, the commentaries they run from people across the span of the reform movement in the church are really quite striking. So to all of those who are tuning in tonight, if you're not members of NCR, I would really encourage you to take out a subscription, because they're covering this as no one else in the country is today. They're covering it week by week, day by day, and they're now an online daily. So, and by the way, they're not paying me, and they don't pay much anyway. So this is all gratuitous. But
are there any other outlets or reporters that we should be looking out for that are doing particularly good reporting in this area?
Yeah, I want to mention a couple. In the Chicago Sun-Times, Robert Herguth, an investigative reporter, has done an extraordinary series in the last year and a half on religious orders and what they're covering up, particularly those that have a headquarters in Chicago. Absolutely amazing that the priests that they're keeping at their retirement homes who have abused children, or the priests that they're keeping off their lists who have been credibly accused. The North Jersey, the Bergen Record, northjersey.com, has done amazing stories on McCarrick, uncovering his goings on at his beach house, and Dina Yellen and Abbott Koloff. Abbott Koloff goes way, way back. In Buffalo, Buffalo, the church was forced to remove Bishop Richard Malone. He was covering up, it turns out, for dozens of abusive priests, and all that would not have happened without coverage by the Buffalo News and WKBW TV. And then here in Massachusetts, I just want to give a shout out to a little paper that I've never dealt with, actually, called the Berkshire Eagle. And they're close to my heart because the longtime bishop of Springfield Diocese in Massachusetts was a bishop named Christopher Weldon. From 1950 to 1977, he ruled that diocese. And thanks to the Berkshire Eagle, We know now that he was a pedophile, that he organized gang rapes of kids, that he destroyed documents, and they are just a tiny paper that is doing groundbreaking stuff. So, and the Associated Press has become incredibly important, especially as a lot of local newspapers have died out. But Nicole Winfield, who's had the Vatican beat for a long time, is incredible. Has really, especially on the Chile story, she broke one story after another that forced Pope Francis to do an about face on his excoriation of victims in Chile. And then I just want one more, and then I'm going to be quiet. The Gallup Independent in New Mexico.
Thank you.
Elizabeth Hardin Barola. I don't think it's even on the internet, is it, Jason?
I don't know, but she
is awesome.
She's awesome. Yes.
Yeah. And her editor, who supports her, she's just kind of a one-woman show exposing cover up by the diocese there. And, thank God the victims there have her voice and the power of her reporting.
Excellent. You've given us lots to look for after our conversation tonight. Robbie, I want to ask you an important question. Where would you say that journalists have maybe fallen short in reporting about the abuse crisis?
Well, I think a problem, first of all, in the context of what's happened to media in this country in the last 20 years, is the money that used to sustain our large newsrooms and our coverage has gone away. There are now today half as many daily news reporters in this country as there were in 2004. Many newspapers are so-called ghost papers. They have only a small handful of reporters. They can't even begin to think about doing investigative reporting. I had helped some of my former students get jobs at what were once good papers, and in more than one case, the former students have come back to me and said, I wanted to do an investigative story, and the editor said, well, if I wanted to do it, I'd have to do it on my own time. So, one of our problems, even when we were flush with cash and had newsrooms that were pretty large, is that our attention span, even on important stories, is not as long as it should be. On this story, I'd have to say that the Globe, after we finished our work, the Spotlight team finished its work in 2003, so that was after 20 months of work, that the amount of coverage fell off. I mean, the Globe stayed with the story, not as aggressively, obviously, but they stayed with it for a few years. But now it's difficult to get coverage on this issue. In fact, some of the best coverage, you actually have to look overseas now. I mean, there would be no disclosure in Poland, but for really courageous journalists in France, in Spain, in Germany, where the church has been forced to acknowledge some of the extent of its crimes because of journalism. And much of that journalism in countries that you would not have expected it to happen. And so, I mean, that's encouraging. It's encouraging, I think, also in the sort of larger context of our society. And Jason mentioned this earlier, is that people who are victims of this kind of abuse are, I think, much more likely to come forward now. I think that a fair amount of the impetus for disclosures in, for instance, against the Boy Scouts. And I think even some of the willingness of women who have been victims of sexual predators in the workplace have been more willing to speak out. Partly because of this, I think there's been a societal change for the better. Obviously, parents are much more attuned now to potential risks that children take.
I just want to pick up on something Walter said, Aaron, which is about Poland. The importance of the press there, a really appalling story is this week, which is that there's a priest who's been convicted of child molestation, and his victim, the victim whose abuse caused him to be convicted, has now filed a civil suit and is in civil court. And the church, fighting his lawsuit, filed a document demanding the right to investigate his sexual orientation and whether he experienced pleasure during the sexual assault. He was 12 years old. And the reason this is important is twofold. Number one, the church is still at it, where there isn't vigilance, where the laws are still not on the sides of the victims. The church is still doing this. But number two, we would not know about that court document if a news portal in Poland hadn't reported on it.
Excellent. Thank you for telling us about that. I want to move on to a question from the audience because this seems important. Obviously we know that sexual abuse is a sad fact of life. It happens, on sports teams. We mentioned scouting before, just to name a few examples. But how do you respond to people who suggest that the Catholic Church is unfairly targeted in investigations like this, that this somehow reflects an anti-Catholic bias?
Let me just start this part of the discussion. At a time when the globe was under attack for our initial reporting, the fact is that some of the most conservative Catholics who detested the globe for other reasons, having to do probably with its liberal editorial page, its pro-choice position on abortion and that sort of thing, were among the first to pick up their phones and call us and thank us for what we did, because A, it was documented. It was irrefutable evidence. And B, they had raised their children in the Catholic Church and they were horrified about what their church had done. And on the other side of that, there were a few voices who I think have been largely discredited, who claim that this is anti-Catholic bias. It's not. This is, as I said earlier, one of the most iconic institutions in our world. A quarter of Americans were raised or are Catholics, and all of us, our childhood was entrusted to the church, and this trust was so abused that how could we not report this? If ever the public had a right to know, this was the case. And you can't say that the reporting on this has been in any way irresponsible. It's been very careful, it's been fact-checked, and there's virtually no case I can think of where the press has gotten this wrong. If anything, our coverage has been understated on this issue.
I want to do a footnote to that, in no way disagreeing with what Walter just said. I think what we're seeing now is something quite different, however. It is not an attack on the press for exposing abuse cover-ups. What we're seeing is a very menacing, ultra-conservative movement within the church that is homophobic and is attacking not just gay priests, but by extension, gay people, gay men particularly. And there is a money machine behind this, an extraordinary amount of money. EWTN, the TV network that is so conservative and hostile to Pope Francis, the Napa Institute, its big president and major donor, Tim Bush, people who are endowing large programs at Notre Dame, at Catholic University of America, and other places. This is really, I never saw this coming, and not that I claim to have a prophetic lens or anything, but this stuff has risen up over the last, it's really, I think, a product of the era of Pope Francis. And I think he has been as good on this, better on this issue than any Pope we've had. He's made some mistakes, but he's owned up to them, which is extraordinary in itself. You know, the fact that he actually has come out and complimented the press for doing the investigative work we've done, the way in which he has tried to move toward a policy of embracing survivors. He's removed a great many negligent and abusive bishops. He's made his mistakes. I mean, he's by no means perfect. But, you know, Massimo Fagioli, the theologian and historian at Villanova University, did a cover story in the Tablet, the English magazine, Catholic magazine, saying that the American church is in a schism. Well, schism is a pretty big word in the culture of the church. It means a split. It means a deep dichotomy. And we are absolutely in one. And, you know, it's almost, and I don't want to inject partisan politics into this, but it is this ultra right-wing money machine that wants to take back control of the church. And many of the bishops are so desperate financially because of the disastrous decisions that they or their immediate predecessors have made. And now, you know, they've got to write checks for these settlements, and they're going into Chapter 11 proceedings. We're living through an era of unseemly chaos. And I think it's quite threatening to the idea that most of us grew up with, which is that the church is a big tent. I mean, one of the things I used to enjoy about the church was I could go into Mass and I'd see somebody over there and I know, well, he doesn't vote the way I do, but we're both going to get up and shake hands at the handshake of peace. That level of amiability, I think, is fast dissipating, and it's sorrowful to see that happen. I don't know where this goes. I don't have a crystal ball, but I see it happening.
Yeah, you bring up a lot of points there, good points. Anne, I wonder if I could turn to you, because we had a question from the audience and that relates to what Jason has just been talking about, which is, what's the way forward for the church?
Well, I disagree. I differ from Jason. I really thought that was a profound analysis of a real polarization that's happening in the Catholic Church. I really disagree that Pope Francis has done a good job. I don't think he has. I think he's a clericalist himself. He's designed a bishop a system for investigating and reporting negligent and abusive bishops that is completely insular, completely controlled by the church, that is not yielding meaningful results. The punishments are not significant. They don't fit the crime. They're far too mild. A few have been removed, but they've been saving face. And some, like Bishop Hart, of Missouri. You know, that's probably the fault of the Congregation for Bishop, but he reportedly abused 18 children, and he got a canonical rebuke and was told to be more prudent. And that was it. He wasn't found guilty at all, even though 2 bishops had said he was credibly accused. Bishop Hepner of Crookston, Minnesota, he forced a victim to recant, and that's not refuted. He forced a victim, a deacon in his own church, to recant his allegation of abuse against a Monsignor. Hepner said, here's the document. This happened in the last 6 or 7 years. The would-be deacon was forced to sign it. And the worst that happened to Hepner was that he too got to, go to the Sun Belt and say, oh, folks, I'm retiring. But there was no censure from the Pope. I think that Pope Francis is doing pretend reform. I think, in fact, what he's done is exert hierarchical control over the entire process. So what is the way forward for the church? I'm not answering your question. I think it remains outside the church. I think the hope I get is that prosecutors are bolder, that the church is being forced to disclose more in court, that I think it just is happening in scattershot ways. Tomorrow we'll probably hear that in India, a bishop in India, Franco Mulakal, has been found guilty of raping a nun. A trial's concluded and the verdict is expected to be in her favor. This will be, a really significant outcome, especially if he goes to jail. By the way, this entire time, despite the overwhelming evidence, he has remained bishop of his diocese, even as these allegations of rape have been public and the evidence has been really substantial. I think that the hope lies in external forces. In New York and New Jersey, we have had thousands of allegations brought forward thanks to revival windows, revival window legislation. Hundreds of priests that we didn't know about can now be added to databases like those at Bishop Accountability as being accused. There's a public document filed in court by a victim. Those kinds of legislation and actions by prosecutors like we're seeing and continued investigative reporting eventually are going to add up to forcing the church to do some significant change. They're going to have to change and revamp canon law really in a radical way and make it less of a priest preservation system and more of a balanced and sane way of addressing allegations and dealing with credibly accused priests and bishops.
Thank you for sharing those insights. Thank you, Anne. We're drawing towards the end of our time together, and we have so many good questions, but I think it's really important for us because we've talked a lot about the role of these outside forces, particularly journalists, in exposing, or reporting on what's really happening in the church today. And so I'm just wondering, what steps can our audience members take to promote good journalism around this issue? And we had a question from an audience member. I'm just going to peek through here to see. So if a local paper no longer has a religion reporter, who would be the most likely to be interested in following the quest for accountability and efforts to reform the church? Panelists, if you can offer your thoughts on this.
A police reporter, someone covering the courts or the cops would be my guess.
Mm-hmm. Robbie, do you have any thoughts on this?
I wish I was hopeful about this, but because of what we discussed earlier, the deplorable financial condition of the press in the United States, news organizations, the vast majority of them just don't have the resources. And that's a shame. And what I could say to people generally is buy a newspaper. Subscribe to your local paper. If you believe in accountability journalism and you put your money down, maybe there'll be enough people like you that they'll go out and hire a reporter who wants to dig into these kinds of stories. And that's a fact. And I think, frankly, there is, I have some hope now that the future of nonprofit news sites in a lot of these communities that don't have any real coverage is something that can be very successful, that philanthropists are beginning to realize that the public, an informed public, leads to a civically engaged community, more accountable behavior by public officials, and they're willing to support that. They now see journalism as a public good akin to that of the local museum. And so I think there's hope that down the road we'll have much more of that kind of journalism and reporters who can do this kind of story.
What would you say about writing letters to the editor? Does that matter, Robbie and Jason, when there's a story and it gets a response from the public? Is that seen as encouragement to do more of those kinds of stories?
Yes, I think it is, although at larger news organizations, there's a wall between the people who publish the letters on the editorial page and those who are on the news side. And there are a fair number of editors and reporters who make it a point not to read their own paper's editorial policy because they don't want to affect their thinking about the story. And the problem in the last 20 years is that it's so easy to write a letter to the editor now that, people bang them out day in and day out, and your chance of getting one published is pretty tiny, unfortunately.
Interesting. I thank you for asking that question, Anne. I'm really conscious of the time, and so I want to have us maybe pause here at the end to offer kind of an overview. Obviously 20 years have passed since the Spotlight stories. Many more years have passed since your stories appeared, Jason. I'd just like to ask you to reflect, panelists, on what you've learned over the last 20 years about what it takes to help people face a painful truth.
I think the most striking realization I have come to, it's sort of twofold. Catholicism is a culture of passivity. And I don't say that in a jaded or cynical sense, but we have been raised to be obedient and passive to the words of priests, of nuns, of bishops, to accept them as teachers without blemish, without fault, and not to protest. People like Daniel Berrigan and Helen Prejean have staked out dramatic positions in the public square against nuclear arms and against the death penalty. But to actually speak out and demand core changes of the church itself makes many Catholics uneasy. They may like it, they may not, but many of them just don't want to be part of it. I don't know quite how one gets around that. And the other thing that's tied to that, and it's taken me a long time to figure this out, the poet Robert Pinsky, a former poet laureate who teaches at Boston University, has a poem, Gulf Music, in which he says, the past is devious and made up. The man was correct when he said the past is never dead. He's talking about Faulkner. The past is devious and made up. I mean, here we are having this long conversation tonight about excavating a church that we never knew existed. It's a subterranean church. It's an underworld. And but for the press and, you know, some attorneys willing to file lawsuits and much later prosecutors, this would never have come out. So the real question to me is, how do we change the narrative sensibility about being Catholic and at the same time not attack the faith, but demand justice of the people who are in charge? I don't know where the answer lies, but at least we're discovering the questions. That's my take.
Excellent. And Anne and Robbie, is there anything that you could briefly add to those thoughts by Jason?
I would, to the question, say that it's apparent to me that Catholics have been willing to accept the painful truth, considering the alternative. And the alternative is that we wouldn't know about this, that it would continue, that the church would do nothing to separate the priests from potential victims. And I'd like to think that a more empowered faithful would have a bigger impact on the church going forward. I guess sometimes I'm pessimistic because I do agree with Anne on this, that I don't think Pope Francis, I think his PR has been a little better, but I think the results are not encouraging. And I also think that until and unless the church becomes transparent and gets the whole story out there, their ability to return to some sort of iconic status is severely diminished.
Thank you. Anne, would you like to close us out?
Yeah, well, I think both Robbie and Jason have given beautiful responses, and I don't really have anything as profound to add. What moves me the most about our work, and I'm sure that Jason and Robbie have found this too, even more so, is the response from survivors. You know, when we provide information, that's all we're doing. You know, my colleague Susie Nauman researches assignment histories, and sometimes all she can do for a survivor, we have no information about that priest, but Susie will find out everywhere where he served. And for some reason, that document that she creates of the assignment history is in a small way empowering, and it starts giving the survivor just something to work with, you know, because the church, God knows, is not going to voluntarily, in most cases, give him any information or give her any information. So I think providing people information is the best way to address the pain. The information can be painful, but as Robbie said, the alternative is far worse. You know, the more information we can transfer from the church's control and darkness to the open square, the public square, the better off the church is, and certainly the healthier, the situation is, and more empowered victims are.
Excellent. I just want to give my heartfelt thanks to Jason Berry, Walter Robinson, and Ann Barrett Doyle for joining us this evening. This conversation has meant a lot to all of us. Thank you for sharing your insights. I'd like to turn now, and if I know we're just running a little bit over time, if you could just bear with us just for a few more minutes, folks. I'd like to pass the microphone to my colleague, Mary Gentile of Awake Milwaukee. She has a few more closing thoughts for us. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to thank all three of you again, and you, Erin, for facilitating such a great discussion. All three of you, your life's work is just, it has opened so many eyes and opens minds, and of course is opening our hearts as well. Since our intention with this series, Courageous Conversations, is that conversation leads to action. As we end this evening's conversation, we want to invite everyone here to take some specific actions in response to what we've heard tonight. So give me just a couple of minutes to share some thoughts we've come up with you. The first action step we invite you to take is to join us for part 2 of this conversation next Thursday, January 20th. We look forward to engaging with you in dialogue about what we heard Erin, Jason, Ann, and Robbie discuss tonight. So we'll gather again at 7 Central Time on Zoom. And as a large group, we'll review some key points from tonight, and then we'll break into small groups for discussion, and then end back in large group, sharing key reflections and ideas. This process worked really well with our first 2 courageous conversations of the season. Please consider joining us so we can engage further with you next week. We received a lot more questions than we were able to address tonight. Next week's going to give us a great chance to dig into some of those. So the opportunity to register for part 2, it's going to be part of a follow-up survey that you'll receive tonight. So please watch for that email and take a moment to fill it out soon so we know who'll be joining us. And then for everyone, including those of you who know you can't join us next week, we want to offer some other ideas for action steps. We want to encourage everybody to consider the following 4 simple actions. 1, keep yourself updated by checking out bishopaccountability.org on a regular basis. 2, we've heard tonight how important local journalism is in keeping our institutions accountable. So as Robbie suggested, if you are not already a subscriber, subscribe to and support your local newspaper. 3, contact your local media representatives and let them know you're interested in hearing about the steps your local diocese has taken to address this crisis. 4, when you read stories that impact you, share them with others and tell them how it's impacted you personally. We'd really like everyone to reply to the follow-up email and fill out the survey. Those surveys, the feedback they give us, it's really helpful to our planning team, Erin and Sarah and Catherine, and a couple of others that help us in our planning. And of course, we would like you to consider whether you can donate to Awake in order to support events like this. We're also always looking for volunteers, and we have many ways we can put people near and far to use. If you have even just a little bit of time to spare each month. Finally, Awake always especially encourages everyone, find time and space to listen to what survivors say, what they want us to know. Our website can direct you to many resources. Also, in this vein, our next Courageous Conversation will be entitled Why the Church Needs Survivors' Stories. It's going to feature Father Jerry McClone of Georgetown University and Paula Kemper of the Archdiocese of St. Paul, Minneapolis, who are both abuse survivors themselves. It's going to take place on March 10th. Mark your calendars and watch our social media for your emails from Awake and for more details about that. For those of you attending tonight because you experienced abuse in the Catholic Church, we're grateful you chose to join us. If you're looking for resources for ongoing support, we invite you to visit Awake's website and select For Survivors tab for information. Once again, Please watch for that follow-up email tonight, including that survey with the registration for next week's dialogue opportunity. So the leadership of Awake is moved to our work and in and through faith. And so in that spirit, when we gather, we pray together. So tonight we're going to end with a very short prayer, and we invite everyone who wishes to stay on to join us for that prayer. Others may sign off. Know that we wish everyone here peace and goodness, and we hope to see you again. For those of you who do want to join us in prayer, we're going to begin that now with the traditional sign of the Christian faith. In the name of the Father, Creator, and Son, Redeemer, and the Holy Spirit, who sustains us all. Be near to us, comfort, guide, and protect all of us, but especially the wounded who are dear to you. In the midst of our concerns, anxieties, frustrations, fears, sadness, anger, and uncertainties, provide us with the strengths and the gifts needed to see and tend to the wounded and to build the beloved community of love and belonging that you intend and desire for us all. Amen. Thank you for joining us. Good night, everyone.